Welcome today to our Stegner Center, Wallace Stegner Center Green Bag, Life After Dead Pool, Lake Powell's Last Days, and the Rebirth of the Colorado River, where we'll be hearing from Zak Podmore, an award-winning author, journalist, and conservationist. So thank you so much for being here today. Welcome to those in the room. We have a really nice crowd, and to those people online. My name is Beth Parker, and I'm a research professor of law here at the law school, and also a senior fellow at the Stegner Center, and am the associate director of the Great Salt Lake Project, also at the Stegner Center here at the law school. And I want to welcome everybody on behalf of the College of Law and the Stegner Center. Thanks so much for being here. As we begin, I'm honored to read the university's Native Lands Acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationships between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. Before we dive in, I want to just take a minute and highlight two future events. So in November, the Stegner Center will host an event featuring our very own Bob Kiter, who will discuss his new book, Conserving Nature in Greater Yellowstone Controversy and Change in an Iconic Ecosystem. We will also have a program on recent Supreme Court rulings on environmental and natural resources. You can find details about these events posted online on the Stegner Center calendar, so please stay tuned. And then also looking forward, it's hard to think into 2026, but if you can mark your calendars for March 19th through 20th, that will be our Wallace Stegner Center 31st Annual Symposium, and it will be focusing on public lands in the American West. So save the date and please plan to join us. We would love to have you there. Okay, so for today, we welcome Zak Podmore. I'm going to give just a little overview before turning the time over to Zak. In Life After Dead Pool, Lake Powell's Last Days, and the Rebirth of the Colorado River, Zak Podmore discusses Lake Powell as he explores the complex challenges and decades of drought have brought to the American West, as well as the potential for a sustainable future ahead. And using both science and storytelling, Zak illustrates that the West's water challenges are not unsolvable. So Zak Podmore is an award-winning author and journalist who has spent more than a decade writing about water and conservation issues in the Western United States. He's the author of two books published by Torrey House Press. The first one is Confluence, Navigating the Personal and Political on Rivers of the New West. That was in 2019. And then what Zak will be discussing about today, Life After Dead Pool, Lake Powell's Last Days, and the Rebirth of the Colorado River, which was published in 2024. Zak is the recipient of the Ellen Malloy Fund for Desert Writers, and he was the Entrada Institute's writer-in-residence in 2023. Until recently, Zak was a Southern Utah reporter for the Salt Lake Tribune as well, and he lives in Bluff, Utah. After this event, we're lucky enough to have some of Zak's books for sale. So Zak also said that he will be happy to sign them. So his books will be for sale out here in the hallway, and he'll be happy to sign them. We are going to reserve the last about 10, maybe 15 minutes for questions. And to ask questions, you can go to slido.com and hashtag Stegner. That's the sort of password. And if you like a question that another attendee has asked, please click the thumbs up icon to like that question, and then it will rise to the top of the list based on priority. Before we turn the time over to Zak, we also ask that you please join us in thanking the Cultural Vision 30-Year Endowment Fund, whose generous support of the Stegner Center has made it possible to bring Zak Podmore to Salt Lake City and host this presentation. So thank you to Cultural Vision 30-Year Endowment Fund, and please join me in welcoming Zak Podmore.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Beth. Thanks to the Stegner Center and some of the folks who are here from the law school for inviting me today, Jan and John Ruppel. It's an honor to be here. As Beth said, I came up from the city of Bluff, Utah over the last night, slept in Price, got up here this morning, made it, and now I'm told between you and the audience that's online, this is greater than the population of Bluff in its entirety. So this is, wild for me to be up here in the big city, but it's really nice to be here, and thank you all for coming out today. It's also cool to be at the Stegner Center. Wallace Stegner was one of the few that was lucky enough to raft through Glen Canyon before the Glen Canyon Dam was built. He went on the trip in the late 40s with the legendary boatman Norm Neville's Mexican Hat Expeditions. They went down the San Juan River into the heart of Glen Canyon, stopped at Rainbow Bridge, and floated down to Lee's Ferry. And in Stegner's later writings in the 60s, after Lake Powell was filling, about the Glen Canyon Dam, he expressed a lot of the same grief that other people who saw the Glen Canyon before the dam expressed in their writings at the time. It wasn't quite as bold as someone like Edward Abbey. He wasn't calling for the dam to be blown up or anything like that. But in his wise and measured way, he kind of had a compromise proposal in one of his essays in the 60s to close just one section of the lake, the Escalante arm of Lake Powell, to motorized traffic. And of course, for the Bureau of Reclamation and for the growing motorized recreation economy on Lake Powell at that time, that was not a compromise they were willing to make. There are no parts of Lake Powell that are closed to motorized traffic. There's only a couple of canyons that are designated wake-free zones, and they're very small and few and far between. But it would be kind of interesting to think about what would have happened if they had taken Wallace Stegner's idea and there was a kind of canoe economy in one section of Lake Powell where people would motor out and then spend a few days canoeing around in the Escalante arm and hiking up the side canyons, and how that would change our vision of this place, which tends to be fairly divided between people who love the best houseboat destination in the world, is probably what Lake Powell is, and people who still remember or who have heard about the loss of Glen Canyon in the 60s and 70s and the national park quality landscape that was buried under water and now sediment. So just a shout out to our man Stegner there. I was drawn to this story of what's happening in Glen Canyon thanks to the research of some people who are in this room, like Carrie Johnson, a geologist, and the Returning Rapids Project in Moab. We'll get into more of that later. But I'd been working as an environmental journalist for quite some time at that point in 2021 when I started this book. And a lot of the stories I told as an environmental journalist were pretty depressing, I'd say. If you haven't noticed, there's some things in the world that are a bit of a mess. What's happening to Glen Canyon, what's happening to Lake Powell is a climate change story. That's why it hasn't been full since 1999. That's why we've seen record low levels in recent years. But the side effect of this climate change story that's draining the Colorado River is that this amazing landscape is coming back to life very quickly and in surprising ways. And there's what I would consider to be one of the largest examples of restoration in the history of the West unfolding before our eyes right now in Glen Canyon, completely by accident. There's no one out there managing it, trying to accelerate this, but it's happening on 100,000 acres of land that used to be buried by Lake Powell. So that's what really got me into this project, and I hope that's what brought some of you here, and whether you know more of the story or less of it, I hope this is an interesting exploration of some of those aspects of what's happening in Glen Canyon. Let's see. Oh, I gotta go from the here. There we go. Okay, thank you. I won't click the keyboard, just the clicker. This is a story about this plug of concrete across Glen Canyon, the Glen Canyon Dam, of course, which creates Lake Powell. But the Lake Powell isn't the first reservoir to exist in Glen Canyon. Around 900 years ago, ancestral Puebloan farmers built this much smaller reservoir beneath a seep that was coming out of the hillside in the low cliffs that line Glen Canyon. And the water was kind of sinking into the ground, and they built this tank that was capable of storing around 10,000 gallons worth of water. It had one little opening at the bottom of these 5-foot thick walls that were watertight, and presumably when the tank was filled up with water, a diver would plunge down to the bottom of the pool and pull a plug on this little outlet drain at the bottom of the tank, and water would flow out into a canal system that went for about 3/4 of a mile down slope. It branched into different canals, it had head gates on it, and it was capable of watering several acres of crops on the side of the Colorado River there. So I begin the book by talking about this ancient stone tank, one to acknowledge that people have been living and farming in Glen Canyon for many thousands of years, and they're continuing to do so when Lake Powell started to fill, but also to talk about a way in which this ancient piece of engineering had in one way a better design than the Glen Canyon Dam itself. So I'll start by just reading a little bit about that. Like the indigenous farmers' ancient stone tank, the Glen Canyon Dam is an impressive feat of engineering. Around 300 feet thick at its base and with a curving 25-foot thick crest that extends for nearly 1/3 of a mile, the Glen Canyon Dam was, at the time of its construction, one of the highest concrete arch dams in the world, and it is large enough to tower over the Great Pyramid of Giza. Before it started to silt in, Lake Powell boasted a storage capacity of 27 million acre-feet, and it was capable of holding back over 2 years' worth of the Colorado River's average annual flow. The 186-mile-long reservoir oozes across maps of southern Utah like a Rorschachian ink stain, filling over 100 side canyons to form a houseboat paradise that draws millions of annual visitors. The dam's hydroelectric plant can generate 7,000 gigawatt hours each year, enough to light nearly 600,000 homes, at least back in its heyday. It's much less than that now. But had the builders of the much smaller reservoir on the riverside dune in the 12th century witnessed the flooding of their handiwork by Lake Powell far in the future, they likely would have noticed that the Glen Canyon Dam had a serious design flaw. The Bureau of Reclamation's best minds forgot to install something that the builders of the spring-fed tank had considered key: a drain at the bottom. So when the Glen Canyon Dam was being built, there were 2 giant tunnels that were drilled through the sandstone cliffs around the construction site. And the entire flow of the Colorado River was diverted into the cliffside and came out downstream so they could pour the concrete in the river channel without it washing away. But as the dam was nearing completion, both of those tunnels were filled with reinforced concrete. And right now, there are only 3 ways to release water through the Glen Canyon Dam and into the Grand Canyon, which begins just downstream. There's the spillways at the very top of the dam, which are only used when Lake Powell is close to full. Famously, they were used in 1983. If you've read The Emerald Mile or some stories from 1983, you know that Lake Powell was very close to overflowing the top of the dam. They had to put plywood on top of the spillways. The tunnels that connect to the spillways were blasting out, car-sized chunks of rock as they were eroding, and the Glen Canyon Dam almost collapsed in '83 from too much water passing through, kind of the opposite problem we have now. The main way that water is released through the dam is through the hydropower penstocks that generate hydroelectricity. And they've worked more or less as intended for 60 plus years now. And then there's one other set of outlets called the river outlet works, which are still hundreds of feet above the historic elevation of the river, that have also had their own cavitation problems sometimes in the past when they've been used. And it gets very dangerous to allow Lake Powell to get below the level of minimum power pool that you see on that graphic there. There's concerns about being able to release enough water physically downstream to meet the downstream need. And there's also concerns about the integrity of the dam itself. And we're just one bad snow year away from, according to the Bureau of Reclamation's own projections right now, from reaching that minimum power pool level by next fall or very close to it. So we are, if you've been studying, maybe you know this issue well, but if you've just been hearing a little bit about the crisis on the Colorado River, the design of the Glen Canyon Dam and this issue of minimum power pool is right at the center of the crisis and the negotiations that are going on right now. There are kind of three major ways to think about what Lake Powell is and what it does, at least in my mind. There's Lake Powell as part of the Colorado River plumbing system that supplies 40 million people with water across 7 states, 2 countries, 30 Native American nations. And the Glen Canyon Dam, as you can see on the map, is located right in the center of all of that. It's also located just upstream of that black line you see on the map. That's the division between the upper and lower basin states of the Colorado River Basin, a political line that was drawn in 1922 under the Colorado River Compact. And the Glen Canyon Dam was built both to provide revenue from the hydropower to construct new irrigation projects in the upper basin after the 1960s, also to store water to ensure that California didn't get any of the upper basin's water that it wasn't owed. So, before the water would just flow down through the Grand Canyon and end up in California, it was getting used down there. Now it's easier to keep water in the upper basin and store water during wet years, in theory, at least back when there was enough water to do that, and release it during drier years. I think the main way people experience Lake Powell in the general public, maybe not law students here, but out in the wider world, is, as I mentioned earlier, houseboat paradise. I mean, I haven't been on a houseboat ever, but many times I was out there when I was writing this book, kayaking along in my sea kayak, sunburned. There's waves, coming over the boat. I'm all chapped, and there'll be a houseboat going by with shade on the deck. Everyone's got an iced cold drink in their hands. There's music blasting off the houseboat. They got the hot dogs going on the grill. They're all dancing on the deck. They never offered to help me out, but they knew I'd probably, got myself in trouble there on purpose somehow. And it looked very nice, but I haven't experienced it yet. But I did get to go in this pontoon boat pictured here. This is Jack Stouse from the Glen Canyon Institute, a nonprofit here in Salt Lake that is working to restore Glen Canyon. So, they're seen as the anti-dam environmentalists out in the Lake Powell recreation community. But you get Jack behind the wheel of a pontoon boat. He gets his pit vipers on. He's ready to roll. So I did get a taste of the high life on Lake Powell. The kind of third way you hear Lake Powell discussed, or Glen Canyon discussed, is as an environmental travesty that drowned an area that almost certainly would be a national park today had it not been flooded under Lake Powell. And you have people like Edward Abbey and the great folk singer Katie Lee, who both floated the river before the dam. who spent the rest of their lives along with Wallace Stegner to some extent, fighting to have a future where the dam looks something like that. The cover of Abby's book. You even had Katie Lee posing with her monkey wrench and her dynamite when she was in her 80s there, keeping that dream alive. And you can see why, people who saw the river as a river also fell in love with this landscape and were heartbroken by it. There was over 150 miles of river with these peaceful winding curves, waterfalls, arches, just thousands of archaeological sites, these winding canyons where you could walk up along flowing streams for miles, even in the middle of desert, past grottos of cottonwood. And that's the propaganda that I was exposed to most as I was growing up in Western Colorado. My family was river runners. They were both school teachers. We'd do trips in Utah every summer on the Green or Colorado or San Juan rivers, and often hear around the campfire about the river trip we'd never get to do, which was Glen Canyon. So I'm just, disclosing my bias. The first time I saw Glen Canyon was in 2011 when my friend and I, who had just graduated, we had just graduated college, and we decided we wanted to go on the longest river trip possible. So we started up in the Wind River Mountains of Wyoming at the source of the Green River in winter, because that was the only time we could get permits for all the river sections downstream. It was late October, so not quite winter yet, but it felt like it up there. And we left the little creek that was flowing out of this lake in pack rafts and continued downstream for a couple weeks until we had enough water to get into sea kayaks. And we paddled across southern Wyoming and into Utah through the Gates Lador, Desolation Gray, Labyrinth, Stillwater, Cataract Canyons. And it took us about a month and a half to get down to the confluence with the Colorado River, which I think was 900 miles downstream. And we had developed a bad habit at that point in the trip of always being a little bit behind schedule. I mean, the days were short. We were not getting up in the dark every morning, because it was too cold. So we'd wait till the sun would hit us, sometimes, and then we'd paddle into the night to make the miles we needed to make. So we came through Cataract Canyon, ran the rapids. We're feeling good. We're like, let's go a little further. It was dusk, and then it was dark, and at that point, Lake Powell was at its high stand since around 2003 or so. It had just come up a lot in that previous winter, and it backed up into Lower Cataract Canyon, and there were just these walls of sediment that were coming down into the lake with no way to exit. So we were paddling along in the dark, and we realized we couldn't find a campsite. Remember, there was ice forming on our dry suits, ice on the kayak. We were both blaming the other person for how we'd ended up in this situation. We missed our dinner time, very cold, and we paddled all the way to Dark Canyon, where we finally found a place to climb up on top of the sediment, which also wasn't easy. We sunk in the mud. I remember my shoes got ripped off. It smelled horrible. And when we finally got into our campsite, I thought every horrible thing I'd ever heard about Lake Powell was absolutely true. It was the worst place on the planet, and we had to get across it before we could get into the Grand Canyon where we wanted to be. So we just spent 7 days paddling in the wind as fast as we could across Lake Powell. We didn't explore any of the side canyons, and we went around the dam and then spent a few weeks in the Grand Canyon and tried to put Lake Powell out of our minds. After we went across Lake Mead and through all the smaller reservoirs along the Arizona-California border, we got to the place where the last remnants of the Colorado River are diverted out of the riverbed at the U.S.-Mexico border and into a canal system. We got back in our pack rafts and floated the canals for 5 days along the dry riverbed and through all the farm fields until the canals dried up as well. And then we slogged our way through the tamarisk and mud to the Gulf of California, looking a lot hairier than when we started out 4 months earlier. And whenever I thought back on that trip after we had shaved, there were so many places in the Colorado River Basin that we had passed that I wanted to go back and spend more time in. Lake Powell was kind of at the bottom of the list. This is the image I had in my mind of what Lake Powell was like. There are places around Lake Powell that are like this, and I was like, not until somebody invites me on the houseboat will I go back there. But that changed, as I briefly mentioned, in 2021 when I was working for the Salt Lake Tribune. I was doing an article on the Returning Rapids Project, the nonprofit in Moab that gets scientists like Carrie Johnson here and maybe some others in the audience out to the former bed of Lake Powell to do all sorts of research, from the fish research to the ecology and how that's changing, to the sediment, to water samples. And there's just an amazing opportunity for all sorts of science to study a place that experienced the same impact at the same time. And if you know your elevation when you're in the former bed of Lake Powell, now on dry land, you know exactly how long it's been since that place was last flooded. So you kind of have a giant laboratory out there to see how long it takes for different species to return, how long it takes for the sediment to wash away. There's much more complicated ways to say this, but as I was listening to these researchers talk about their passion for this place, how exciting it was, and how there was a lot of good news about the ecology coming back really quickly, when I was on this river trip, I realized that I needed to go and see some more of it. So that's what I spent the next couple years doing, including with some of the experts who were on that first trip. So there's a lot of chapters in the book, each one kind of focused on a different topic, a lot of them science or policy related, but I'll just boil it down into 3 big concepts for this talk. This is a very original idea that I've been using for some time now, because as a creative person, as a writer, I just have these amazing original thoughts come to me all the time. And so this one is called The Bad, the Ugly, and the Good. And I think it has a nice ring to it. I didn't take it from anywhere. But the bad in this story is climate change. It's a big part of why we've ended up where we are at Lake Powell. And over the last 25 plus years now, the Southwest has grown a lot hotter, indicated by the red, and a lot drier, indicated by that brown splotch directly over the Colorado River Basin. The flow of the Colorado River has declined by around 1/5 compared to the previous century since the year 2000. This graph shows that in a different way from Jack Schmidt at USU. There's those really wet years on the blue line in the 80s when the Glen Canyon Dam almost broke from having too much water in it. There were the pretty good years in the 90s, which brought Lake Powell in 1999 close to 100% full. And you can see since then the peaks are getting lower and the troughs deeper. Meanwhile, that red line shows the total use and loss throughout the basin, which has remained relatively flat. So we have 20% less water, but we use almost the same amount of water as we did in the 90s, and that's been possible for 25 years now because we had the 2 largest reservoirs in the United States, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, that were full in 1999, but we've drained them almost to the breaking point right now. In 2022, when I was in the middle of researching this book, we started to hear a greater sense of urgency around trying to balance the water budget, it's often called. I'm sure people have heard that. Getting the supply of water, the natural supply of water that's coming down the rivers in the form of snowmelt, in balance with the demand for water throughout the basin. And we've been using more water than exists than actually flows on average each year for some time now. And that's only possible until the reservoirs dry up. And 2022 is interesting because It's almost the exact situation we're facing right now in 2025. Lake Powell is at a similar level. It's dropping at a similar rate. We're just one bad snow year away from facing real crisis at the Glen Canyon Dam. There are negotiations going on between the 7 Colorado River Basin states about how to address this problem that, as far as I can tell, haven't gotten very far. That was just the exact same thing that was happening in 2022. And instead of, saving the day with some brilliant plan of deciding who was going to use less water or how everyone was going to use less water, it just started snowing that winter in 2022, 2023. Lake Powell went up from around 20% full to around 40% full. And everyone was like, oh, okay, we got some time to, not make a decision again. But now we're right back to where we were, and the negotiations are still at an impasse, seemingly, and we will see if it starts snowing in the next few months here, or if we finally have to face a reckoning in the basin. For the first time in 2022, there was a announcement quietly from the Bureau of Reclamation that there were studies underway to look at potentially modifying the Glen Canyon Dam to fix that problem of dead pool or minimum power pool, where you would have 5.5 million acre feet of water trapped in Lake Powell with no easy way to release it downstream. And having issues, record low water in the Grand Canyon potentially, facing dead pool on Lake Mead, leading to cuts throughout the lower Colorado River Basin, where 27 million people rely on Colorado River water. It's a really bad situation to have while you also have a substantial amount of water just sitting and trapped in Lake Powell because of the design of the dam. So there was some discussion about drilling tunnels, maybe through the sandstone cliffs at a lower elevation than the river outlet works are at now, that would allow more of that water to be released in an emergency scenario. But that obviously hasn't started yet, the drilling. On Lake Powell, through those years, you could see the changes every time you went out there. It was just drying up before your eyes. Now we come to step 2 of our journey, the Domini Formation. This is not a name that I came up with. These are, people who are much smarter than me said jokingly, what do we call the sediment that's been trapped in Lake Powell since 1963? Let's call it the Domini Formation, after the commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation in the 1960s, who was such a proponent for the Glen Canyon Dam, Mr. Floyd Domini. And to be clear here, I do not think Floyd Domini was ugly. He was a beautiful man, but his formation is a little bit ugly, I have to say. And no offense, Carrie, there, because she's an expert on its beauty as well. But if you've been through Cataract Canyon, you floated through the big drops there, and you cross over the high water mark of Lake Powell, and pretty soon you see these giant banks of Domini Formation sediment, and they dominate that lower section of the canyon. They're eroded a bit since 2011. The camping is much nicer there. There are whole rapids that have reemerged from the sediment that used to be there in Cataract Canyon and are coming back to life. I just got to run one of them for the first time a couple weeks ago. It was very exciting. It wasn't there the last time I'd been there in 2021, and it's a full-on huge rapid now, gypsum. So when I started this project, I had an assumption that if Lake Powell were to disappear tomorrow, this is the kind of thing you'd see throughout all of Glen Canyon, and it would take hundreds of years for this sediment to start to clear away and for the canyon to restore itself. But that's not really the case, at least not yet. And if you take a trip down the San Juan River below Clay Hills, you can see why that's the case. You portage around a waterfall that is formed in the Domini Formation, and then you continue through a section of river that looks a little bit more like a natural river than Lower Cataract. The banks are lower. There's mostly native species on the banks, willows and cottonwoods that have grown 50 feet tall since this area was last underwater in 2011. There's beavers, we saw peregrines, river otters. It feels like a really healthy river landscape, even though it's only been that way for the last 14 years now. And as you go a little further, the river starts to carve into the Domini Formation sediments. The water gets muddier. I was following my friend Wade here through this section, who I describe in the book is not a light packer, and here's proof of it. He had in this bag a Dutch oven, a fire blanket, a blowtorch, and like 15 rolls of Pillsbury cinnamon rolls and biscuits and stuff. So every morning he'd start a fire on his fire blanket to catch the ashes and use his blowtorch, and then he put his Dutch oven on there and serve pastries. He also had a ukulele and some other 4 or 5 sleeping pads. And I was pretty worried, following him through this section where rapids can kind of form just in the mud and the sand really rapidly and then disappear, that he would go overboard and be dragged to the bottom of the river by his Dutch oven. But luckily, that was not the case. As you get a little deeper into the canyon, places that have been exposed for a shorter amount of time, the sediment is a little bit more dynamic. There's these mudbergs that are calved off from the sides of the banks. There's mud cracks. There's, you have to be careful about where you step, or you'll end up like Wade did here with a bad morning. But definitely some beautiful parts of it as well. And then you get to the place just above where the river empties into the reservoir, the reservoir delta. And the river spreads way out, gets really shallow. There's often a lot of pelicans roosted right there. And even before the current stops flowing, you can see the really muddy river start to get more and more clear. And then within a few miles, you're on the Lake Powell we love and know, with its crystal blue waters. And almost all the sediment that was been trapped in the river corridor since 1963, and all the sediment that's being carried down naturally, has settled to the bottom of the lake. And I know there's been some updated research on how far the sediment is going past the reservoir delta, but recently the Colorado River Delta was, I think, 130 miles or a little less than that from the Glen Canyon Dam. That means there's 100 plus miles of Colorado River corridor in Glen Canyon that, instead of having 180 feet of sediment like you see in Cataract Canyon, maybe have 10, 20, 30 feet of sediment, and will, restore a lot quicker if they were revealed again. This graphic kind of shows how that works. The Glen Canyon Dam was built in 1963. The reservoir started to fill. There was a little bit of sediment that fell out to the bottom of Glen Canyon. But when the reservoir was full in the 80s and 90s, the vast majority of sediment accumulated at the upstream reaches of the reservoir, over 100 miles from the dam. And since then, the river has carried some of that sediment deeper into the canyon. This is a 12-mile section of river between 2019 and 2022 that you can see just getting consumed with what Mike Dehoff of the Returning Rapids Project calls a glacier of mud. It's just working its way down the canyon over 100 feet thick, 150 feet thick maybe, pushing out into the side canyons and leaving this really sticky, muddy Domini Formation mess that's going to be there for a long time. There's a good side of this story too, I promised. And you can see the ecological rebirth that's occurring in Glen Canyon if you take a trip up pretty much any of the side canyons that have a perennial year-round stream flowing through them. And there's a lot of streams that in the tributaries to Glen Canyon. You start out by paddling through these forests of ghost cottonwood trees, trees that drowned in the 60s and 70s as Lake Powell was filling. They still have the bark on them. It's kind of eerie to go through. You pull your kayak over on the shore of the lake and start walking upstream. If the lake has been dropping, as it is now, you start out by walking through areas that have been exposed for maybe a few weeks or a few months. There's not a lot of activity on them. There's maybe some tumbleweed starting to sprout up. There's all sorts of fascinating trash out there. You can see in this bottom image of the Budweiser can that somebody appears to have shotgunned this Budweiser, allowing them to drink it quite rapidly. And then you walk around the corner of the canyon and you see this, and you should talk to your friends in the archaeology department here about trying to piece together the story of what happened, whether these two events were related or not. And then you get a little higher in elevation to places that have been out of the water for a few years. You see cattails coming back, greater diversity of plants, wildlife moving back in, beavers that have swam across the lake into box canyons even and built these large dams in places that used to be flooded. You can see in this picture there's the bathtub ring that's higher than that cottonwood tree. That's where Lake Powell was in the 90s. And now this giant tree has grown back. There's a really thriving habitat for invertebrates and other things in this beaver dam. This is Seth Ahrens, an ecologist who's been working with Glen Canyon Institute to do just a really basic survey of the plants in Glen Canyon. And he's found in canyon after canyon that after 10, 15, 20 years, the invasive species that first pop up in these places when they're first exposed start to disappear. They're being outcompeted by the native species, willows, cottonwoods, wildflowers, and others. And the places that have been out now since 2000 have really intact, healthy, diverse native ecosystems in them without any active human intervention. There's nobody out there removing tamarisk or Russian olive or anything like that. This is just a process that's unfolded on its own, and it's really, really good news in canyon after canyon ecologically. There are other places that were packed full of mud when they first came out of Lake Powell, or full of sand in the case of these side canyons, that have been able to get cleared out in just a couple of monsoon cycles. So this area used to walk on top of this slot, on top of sand that was filling the slot canyon, and then just a few storms were able to clear it out completely. There's places that you would never know were underwater for decades. Sometimes somebody leaves you a little message on the wall that shows you how quickly this sediment is being cleared out of the side canyons. This picture was taken in 2022, so that brown line beneath the 2020 at the top there was where the sediment was just a couple years earlier. And eventually you end up walking on bedrock again with all the sediment having been removed. Go a little higher and the trees get bigger. You pass the lichen line. The lichen is the last thing to come back in these side canyons. So it can often help you determine where the high water mark was. And then you get into the areas that never flooded. So you take a trip kind of through time, through the stages of ecological change as you go higher and higher up these side canyons. Super cool. In other places, there's cultural resources that are reemerging, ancestral Puebloan steps, pottery, even some petroglyphs that have survived decades underwater. Archaeologists have found baskets and full pots and all sorts of artifacts that didn't decompose under Lake Powell. Historic inscriptions. And places that used to see a lot of visitation in the 90s now require a few miles of hiking and bushwhacking to get to. So the visitor impacts are changing really dramatically as well. There's arches that you used to be able to jet ski through that you now have to hike to, and natural bridges that were once buried that you can boat under. And even the bathtub ring, the first thing a lot of people often think about when they think about low water on Lake Powell is healing in places as well. You can see the brown streaks coming across the bathtub ring. So there's a lot more that I get into in the book, including with a professor of economics here at the University of Utah, Marshall Steinbaum, who has a whole chapter kind of talking about the New Deal economics behind the big dam era. And although has some criticisms of the Glen Canyon Dam, like I do, he's a huge supporter of the economic system that allowed us to build all of these federally owned public power resources from the New Deal through the 1960s. And we kind of explore together in that chapter what it would be like today if we had those resources at our disposal to respond to climate change. What if instead of building dams, we were building renewable energy, wind and solar, and having it federally funded and using the revenue from that public power sale to create even more projects, which is exactly what the Bureau of Reclamation did so successfully in its heyday. There's also a chapter, kind of the history of the Navajo Nation's relationship with Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, the tens of thousands of acres of land that used to be Navajo Nation that became part of the National Park Service system as Lake Powell filled when the boundary line of the Navajo Nation was moved south, and an effort underway to return that boundary line back to where it was in the 1950s, since that change happened without any compensation and a lot of broken promises to the Navajo Nation. So I'll wrap up here. But just to recap, we have a dam that is no longer serving its intended functions. It's generating less electricity than it ever has. It could lose its ability to generate power completely by next year. It poses a threat to all downstream users based on the design of the dam for just releasing water in extreme drought conditions to Arizona and California and Mexico and Nevada. And we have these glaciers of mud that are moving downstream at a rate of sometimes over 100 feet per day that are making the future of Glen Canyon very different after that mud glacier passes through than it would otherwise be. And we have this amazing ecological rebirth happening on its own in the side canyons. And for a long time, the people who saw the Colorado River as plumbing system had a kind of alliance with the houseboaters. When the Glen Canyon Dam was working as intended, producing power, storing water, the benefit of that was that there's this amazing place to do reservoir recreation. And both those groups, got to laugh at people like poor Katie Lee in the 1990s that would say, drain Lake, should get up there, say, drain Lake Powell, blow up the dam. And, there was really no reason to do that back then in the minds of these other constituents. But now that climate change is draining the Colorado River, now that the reservoir recreation has been made a lot more difficult by low water on Lake Powell, most of the boat ramps are closed, losing power, and all of these other issues, there's an opportunity for a realignment, I think, between these different camps and a different formation of alliances, of thinking about what we want the future of the Colorado River to look like. And we can either try to restore Lake Powell to its glory, which involves a lot of praying for rain, or we can try to think about how else we could manage this system. And if we think about what's already happening in Glen Canyon, we can get a sense for that it's not all bad down there, that it's a place that is really amazing to explore already. And although it was a houseboat paradise for many decades, it could also be a symbol of the future of environmental restoration in the Southwest if we cap the reservoir levels or lower them completely and allow the river to return. So I think despite our many challenges on this planet, Lake Powell, Glen Canyon is a symbol of hope and the resiliency of the natural world for me. And I was glad that I got to explore it. And thanks for letting me share some of that with you. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Zak, for not only coming here today, but for all of the time you put into researching and writing this book. It's a lot of work, as you guys could see, that went into this. We have a lot of great questions. One that somebody asked, who is here in this audience, I would assume here in person, as a law student, what can I do now to prepare for a successful career in promoting conservation of these natural resources?
That is a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer necessarily, but I think if you're really passionate about water conservation issues and water policy, there's an endless need for good, attorneys who work on those issues. And I think I don't know if this applies to the legal profession as much, but I feel like Glen Canyon Dam was such a divisive issue in kind of with the publication of the Monkey Wrench Gang, that surrounding Earth First kind of mentality around it, that the camps got pretty well-defined in the 70s, 80s, 90s. There were the people, that were calling for the dam to be removed. There were the people who, as I've mentioned already quite a bit, the other side of that equation. And I think, as I just was saying at the end there's a big shakeup happening because of climate change, because of our failing infrastructure, because of our outdated water laws that are from the 1800s for the most part, that there's a lot of opportunity to think of creative ways to improve every aspect of the system, both for the people who use the water and the farmers in the cities, but also for the landscape itself. And if we just stay focused on the way things were, that's a recipe for disaster, in my opinion. But if we can get creative ways to adapt to the current hydrology, the current paradigm we're in, then there's a lot of ways that things could be better for all parties, I think. There doesn't have to necessarily be, at the same level of divisiveness that there was around this issue back in the day. But maybe that's just me dreaming.
Well, it's nice to hear that there's some room for unity here. Another question that has gotten a lot of thumbs ups, which means that a lot of people want this question asked, is there a big misunderstanding in the general public that the general public has about these issues that you would find a real barrier to reaching a resolution?
I mean, I think there's a few. There's the idea I hear a lot that Lake Powell is helping cities and farmers, which may have been true back a couple decades ago, but is not true anymore. I think the current design of the dam and the current hydrology make it so that Glen Canyon Dam, as it's currently designed, is a huge liability for everyone in the Colorado River system. And there needs to be, if not a complete, decommissioning of the dam, at least an option for getting water out at lower levels than is currently possible. I also think there's a common misunderstanding that the power generated by the dam is really important to the grid, and that there would be blackouts across Phoenix or whatever if the dam stopped generating power. I don't think that's true. Just last year, the dam produced less power than ever before. And we can probably only run a few these mega data centers at this point, let alone Phoenix. The Navajo generating station, the coal plant right next to the Glen Canyon Dam, produced almost twice as much power as the Glen Canyon Dam did. It shut down in 2019, and we were able to replace that power with other sources without any major catastrophes. And the third thing, I think, that I hear a lot from the kind of more environmentalist crowd is that Glen Canyon was a really nice place in the 50s. I would have loved to have seen it. This is kind of what I thought before I started on this project, but it was destroyed by Lake Powell. There's no point in going to these places. There's no point in thinking about a future Colorado River in Glen Canyon because it was all destroyed half a century ago, and that is really not the case at all. It's and really cool landscape to explore. You get the cool trash, the cool beer cans and stuff, but also you can feel a place coming back to life before your very eyes. And there's all sorts of, like this photo here, cathedral in the desert, beautiful places to explore that weren't previously accessible by foot, and it's an awesome treasure hunt out there.
Okay, we probably have time for 2 more questions, and here's a more existential question. Does the federal government have an end-of-life plan for these dams? They are not truly permanent structures, or is surviving a new Colorado River compact all we can do at the moment? This person asks.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer. I hope there's some, file in behind glass somewhere at the Bureau of Reclamation that says like break in case of emergency, where they have all the solutions to all our problems ready to go. And once we get down to minimum power pool in Lake Powell next year, and the things really start to hit the fan, then they'll solve everything, and everyone will be much happier a couple years from now. I don't know if that's the case. There is no end-of-life plan for Glen Canyon Dam, as far as I know. Floyd Dominy, who's a big proponent of the dam, had talked about the issue that it would completely fill with sediment in 700 years. That's a long way off still. We're facing the crisis much sooner than he anticipated, and he famously said, "That's a problem for the people of the future to deal with." So we're, people of the future for him, and I hope there's somebody out there with a plan to at least address the crisis in the short term. But drilling tunnels around the dam would be a good place to start, in my opinion.
That's actually another question, but you also mentioned downstream communities earlier. Could you talk a little bit more about what could happen?
Yeah, so majority of the population in the Colorado River Basin lives downstream of the Glen Canyon Dam in Nevada, Arizona, California. It's also the most productive farmland in the Colorado River Basin, and the source of winter vegetables for most of the U.S., from the Imperial Valley and the fields around Yuma and stuff like that, all irrigated with Colorado River water. So it's incredibly important that people in Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson, San Diego, Los Angeles, Tijuana have water in their taps, of course. It's also important that we don't have to subsist on Colorado River raised beef alone, and can also have some iceberg lettuce on our hamburgers. So I think the Glen Canyon Dam, if it were to drop below the minimum power pool level or to the minimum power pool level, there's a point between minimum power pool and dead pool where even if you have the outlets fully open, you can't deliver 8 million acre feet through the dam that the lower basin in Mexico are accustomed to receiving. And it could get much lower than that depending what's happening upstream. And if you have an issue with the dam, cavitation like happened in 1983 in the river outlet works, you might have to shut part of the dam down to deal with that problem. That would mean just a trickle of water going through the Grand Canyon. That would mean the level of Lake Mead plummeting. It's already super low, but it would plummet very quickly if the Grand Canyon was close to dried up towards dead pool or minimum power pool. The Hoover Dam as well. And then it becomes a lot harder to get water into the Central Arizona project to go to Phoenix, into the All-American Canal to go to the Imperial Valley. And you start to have just a cascade of problems that would be very difficult to deal with all while there is a ton of water trapped in Lake Powell still. So I think that's part of the issue is like, if it happened just that the snows completely stopped falling and all the reservoirs were empty, that's one thing to have to confront. But to have 5.5 million acre feet of water trapped in Lake Powell at minimum power pool and no way to use that water as this crisis is unfolding across the basin, that seems like a bad scenario. So that's one good reason to have a plan B, have a tunnel B around the dam to be able to access that water if we need it. So.
Okay, final question. And maybe you just answered it there, but what do you think is the long-term solution for Lake Powell after having written this book and reported on this?
I mean, I think if you were to design the Colorado River plumbing system today, you would not build the Glen Canyon Dam. Right now, if you were to take water from every single reservoir in the Colorado River Basin, all the small ones in Flaming Gorge in Colorado and on the Arizona-California border, and water from Lake Powell and water from Lake Mead, and put it all into Lake Mead. So all the water that's stored in the basin into Lake Mead would be like 80%, 90% full. So we just have way too much storage throughout the basin. There's no diversions that come out of Lake Powell. There's no irrigation that is drawn from Lake Powell directly. There's only a small municipal diversion. It's only there for storage and hydropower, and that is not working anymore. We're not receiving benefits from either of those things. So I think we should, modify the dam in such a way that we can restore as much of Glen Canyon as possible and make the plumbing system work as efficient and effectively as possible. So that's my 2 cents. Read more about it in the book. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Be out there if you want to chat more.
Really quickly, we do want to thank Zak, and he's written a lot about Utah, so we have this destination, Utah grazing board, and
Whoa.
since you drove up here, we hope that there's room in your car for this gift. But thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us. We're so grateful for your time and for all of your work. And if you're interested in a signed copy, head out to the hallway. Thank you so much, Zak. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, charcuterie.